Chronicles of the Averant Empire. Chapter 2, The Virtuous Maze. Sylvic roused her companions in the late hours of the night.
I am telling you, something is not right with the house on the other side of the street. I saw shadows on the second floor.
Lazir and Rovak were ready in minutes, trading their linen shirts for their usual attire. Alphonse bid Sylvic to wait at his door. He appeared meek and frail, a far cry from the person who walked briskly into battle only a few hours ago. After a minute, the young man opened the door, crimson robe fluttering as he descended the stairs. The four companions crossed the street of cobblestones, keeping their wits about them. The house was crooked, half-timbered and plastered in cob, sagging on one side as if ready to fall on its neighbor. Despite its sorry state, the mansion retained some opulence, standing 3 stories tall, one more floor than most of the residences in the surrounding area. It was crimped by a low wall of stacked stones reinforced by a holly hedge. A small gate of wrought iron stood half open, wiggling lightly in the night gale. The garden, a sea of grass almost as tall as a human, was tousled by the strong wind and disappeared into the back of the house. In front of our 4 companions, a gravel path led to the entrance of the house. Rovak opened the march, closely followed by Sylvic and the others. Noticing that the garden extended to the back, the dwarf attempted to move inconspicuously behind the house. Alas, tired by the fight in the ruins that same night, Rovak forgot he was amidst tall patches of weeds that swished, whirled, and murmured a loud hiss as he dashed. Lazir whispered between his teeth,
"What are you doing, Rovak?"
The reduced visibility caused by the tall grass prevented the dwarf from finding minute clues. But he did notice 2 elements that piqued his curiosity: a locked cellar door, most likely leading to a basement, and an odd little cemetery beyond the low wall of stacked stones. By all accounts, the latter was an oddity in the Averant Empire. Prior to the war against the blighted expanses, most, if not all, corpses and cadavers were sent to the necropolis in convoys protected by the Order of Saint-Gerard. The necropolis was a vast and sprawling primate city, or cemetery of sorts, that extended into the depths of the earth and the bluest skies with the sole purpose of hosting the dead of the empire. The city was manned by a majority of revenant monks and priests until Clemente rose and marched northward. To palliate the annexation of the necropolis, the Empress ordered the construction, in all haste, of a sister city in the north, on the outskirts of Highmount capital. While Rovak reminisced about the history of the necropolis in the backyard, Sylvic lowered herself, half crouching toward the porch of the mansion. Her eyes narrowed on the handle and the lock of the door. The woad elf noticed scratching marks around the keyhole, recently picked. The palm of her hand grabbed the metallic handle, and the door moved with a loud creaking sound, opening on an elongated vestibule with worn tapestries falling off a moldy wall. The wall to the left soon gave way to a small room with old furniture, a table with a few stools, old and dusty. Straight ahead, a set of crooked stairs led to an upper floor. Nestled under the stairs, a door left slightly ajar descended toward the cellar. With her keen eyes, the conduit noticed traces of caked blood in the doorframe leading downward. Turning her gaze upward at the ceiling, Sylvic understood the poor state in which the first floor would be. A gaping wound tore the ceiling wide open, with wooden beams gushing out at the center of the room. Sylvic realized how dusty the place was. Using her knowledge from tracking beasts in the woad, the elf looked closer to the floor. Dust had been lifted in places, leaving foot imprints, small, feminine. The tracks led from the front door to the threshold of the cellar door before heading upstairs and down again to the entrance. The elf gestured to Alphonse and Lazir to come in. Left in the backyard, Rovak had the instinct to backtrack, the tall grass buzzing like a million flies as he returned to the porch. Sylvic pointed out to her 3 companions the caked blood. Alphonse readied his conure and slid through the doorframe downstairs, closely followed by Lazir and Rovak, Sylvic closing the march. The familiar tang of metal burrowed in their nostrils, blood. Alphonse descended the crooked stairs into a wide room, poorly lit by the moonlight, which was piercing through 2 small skylights. For an instant he thought he was in the middle of a butcher's shop. Humanoid figures hung upside down, their feet attached to steel manacles pinned into the ceiling. The Fury stepped into a thick pool of blood with a suction sound, closely followed by the rest of his companions. There must have been a dozen bodies, their throats slit, all hands severed and missing. They searched for hints, but found none. Rovac vaguely remembered a dark ritual that would bestow life upon chopped hands. His eyes were torn away from his trail of thoughts, noticing the cellar door he'd seen outside. The dwarf asked Alphonse for assistance. The young man was happy to oblige. His dress fluttered in the air as he grabbed onto the chain that coiled around the handles. The iron was sent flying, and in an instant fresh air chased away the scent of death. The moonlight leaked into the cellar, illuminating the carnage. It was then that the Fury and the Elementalist noticed a thin trail of blood leading from the cellar into the garden. Indeed, the blood blended itself so well with the earth that it would have been impossible for anyone to notice it without knowing where to look. The small droplets of blood slithered through the garden to the low stone wall and into the cemetery. The two companions stood there silently for an instant, pondering what they should do next before heading back into the cellar. Sylvic headed upstairs once more, wanting to explore the upper floors, Lazir in her wake. The Time Raider headed outside instead of upwards, wanting to see if the house itself had any other tale to tell. He stood there outside, pacing, analyzing each square of stone, squinting at every crack in the wall. Meanwhile, the woad elf had reached the upper floor. All stood twisted here. Wind wailed through broken windows. A few books, swollen by water and time, barely stood in crumbling bookshelves. The gushing opening she had noted before stared back at her, its moldy wooden beams and splinters creaking in a dreadful concert. Across the gaping hole rested another set of crooked stairs. Sylvic spotted two pieces of torn cloth fluttering across the chasm, attached to a splinter. Her gaze scurried across the floor, looking for places where the dust might have been lifted. She quickly found the same tracks she had discovered downstairs. Balancing herself, she stepped where her mysterious suspect had landed their feet. The wood wailed but never gave in, allowing her to cross the crevice without plummeting to the floor below. The woad elf seized the two pieces of cloth. One looked like a silky red robe made of velvet, the other a ribbon one would tie in their hair. The latter bore the symbol of a hand, caught mid-movement as if it were stroking something. Sylvic pocketed the cloth and headed for the second floor. Sylvic was cautious, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. Carefully sneaking up the stairs, she soon reached the second floor where she found a disheveled bedroom with a broken bed covered in soggy linen and sheets. Heavy curtains fluttered, masking shattered windows, blocking any shred of moonlight. She hazarded a peek behind one of the curtains. On the other side of the street stood the greasy mug. The woad elf stood precisely where the shadow had stared at her. Next to the bed stood 4 rectangular wooden boxes, each large enough to fit a body. All crates were open. The woad elf approached and dared to look inside. The first box was filled with dirt and stank of rot. Tattered pieces of worn cloth peered through the dirt. An imprint in the dirt delineated the contours of what could have been a corpse. The 3 other crates were filled with iron spikes nailed into the wood, fresh blood dripping from them. The conduit looked about, worried that a vampire might ambush her alone. Yet nothing came. It was then that she noticed a little writing desk with a recently snuffed-out candle on the ground pressed into a copper candle holder. Grabbing the latter, she quickly recognized the same symbol as the ribbon. She spent time looking around, trying to find anything that could be of use in their quest to retrieve Antonin, but found nothing. She decided to regroup with the rest of her companions, but as she was about to descend the stairs, a gush of wind shook the curtains, picking up a half-burnt piece of paper. The conduit extended her arm and hand in a snapping motion and caught the paper just before it made its way through the fluttering curtains. The burn marks prevented Sylvic from reading the paper completely, but it did mention a certain Jorvik, and that the actions of the vampires and undead were going to reflect poorly on the author of the note. The charred piece of paper prevented Sylvic from reading the name of the writer, but it seemed to start with half of the letter K. The elf stashed the note away and made for the stairs. Outside, Lazir pondered. The house was crooked, sure enough, but it seemed ancient. For such a structure to withstand the test of time, the mansion would need strong foundations. A jolt of genius overcame the Time Raider. What if the foundations ran deeper than a simple basement? Lazir strode back to the house. He met with Sylvic on the ground floor, and both descended to the cellar, where Rovac and Alphonse were hunting for clues. Each companion shared what they had found: the leading trail of blood to the cemetery, the half-burnt note, the foundations of the house, and the odd hand symbol on the ribbon and candle holder. The latter attracted Rovak's attention. He recalled that as they entered town, one noble seemed to hold such a ribbon. The man had mentioned it belonged to one of the girls of the Velvet Fingers, a brothel of the Citadel district. Lazier's idea that there might be more to the house got unanimous nods, and all four companions decided to search the basement before following the trail of blood. Alphonse quickly noticed a patch of stones that rang more hollow than the rest. He hailed Rovak, who used his elementalist skills to tear a hole in the ground. Surprised, the dwarf realized that his feat was quickly stopped by a slab of wood which sported a metallic handle. All failed to lift it, except Alphonse. The young chap grabbed the handle and sent the wooden trap flying against the dead bodies. A ladder descended further down onto a hidden floor where light flickered away. One by one, they slid down the ladder and into the hidden floor. The room was austere: a wooden table, 4 stools, and a little chest propped onto the table. In a corner, an old torch was burning low. Opposite the ladder, a corridor disappeared into nothingness. Sylvik opened the chest and found a long scroll, the deed to the house, dating a few decades back. It was said to be given from Burgmeister Virtuous to Alistair Kentor for loyal services to the town of Osmond. The woad elf shared her findings with her mates before pocketing the deed away. Intrigued by the corridor, the 4 friends grabbed the torch and followed it. They walked into the dark and cold hall for several minutes until they reached an arched double door made of 2 gargantuan slabs of smooth stone, except in a few spots that showed signs of very light chipping. Digging tools stood to the side. The companions understood very quickly that attempting to pierce the door would not be an easy feat. Sylvik reached spiritually to the door and felt a wave of magic overcoming her. She saw, at the junction between the 2 slabs, a depression in the stone in the shape of an ornate star. Lazier looked up and noticed an etching above it: "Only the virtuous succeed." Rovak walked to the slab, laying his hands on it, using his spells to make a hole in it. His palm soon burned and smelled like charred flesh. The dwarf recoiled in blazing pain, the slab now sporting a chasm wide enough for them to crawl through. But the slab was filled with fire and lava, which was churning in its inner layers. The lava swirled around the opening made by the dwarf, dripping heavy beads of raw heat from the top of the hole to its bottom. Sylvik stepped back, arguing that it would probably be best to head back to the surface and search for Antonin and the star-shaped trinket. Yet, before she could finish her argument, Rovak and Alphonse were already on the other side. Both in turn had dared to plunge directly through the hole and stood on the other side of the slab. Sylvik stood, mouth wide open, incapable of knowing if she should stand in awe or fury in the face of such recklessness. Lazier propped himself with all his arms and jumped like a bolt into the fiery hole. The Time Raider was not even grazed. The woad elf sighed, holding her robes before rushing toward the chasm, eyes closed. In a flash, she was on the other side, without even a hint of her robes on fire. The corridor continued ahead. They soon arrived at a wooden door. Sylvik pressed her wide ear against the door, hearing muffled giggling coming from afar. She opened the door carefully and stepped into a hallway, the high-pitched laughter coming from her right. To the left, the corridor took a sharp turn. Her companions followed. They headed away from the giggling, peering at another corridor. It suddenly dawned on the 4 heroes that they might be in a maze below the city. The group walked back toward the giggling until they reached a door from which they could hear the sound of drums. Sylvik opened the door carefully, and all poked their noses in. A swarm of goblins stood in front of them in a narrow and tall room. Boulders had fallen from the ceiling, and a few crude tents of leather and bones stood in a half-circle around a fire. They heard one shouting, "The boss had us searching here, but our gobs keep on dying. We'll never be able to turn into humans. We should just go home." A smacking sound like a slap across the face echoed through the room, and a louder voice yelled, "Get back to work, worm!" The companions closed the door delicately and decided to let the goblins be for now. They could come back on the morrow with the guards to round up the creatures. They dug further into the maze, twisting and turning below the earth, strengthening their hearts and minds as their choices led them from dead ends to corridors to traps. As they advanced deeper into the maze, Rovak felt his eyes glaze over, a wave of warmth overcoming him, telling him to head north. Our heroes moved quickly from one corridor to another until they reached a door that opened onto an odd room. The warm feeling Rovak felt turned into excitement. The room's floor was a grid made of iron bars, and in the center of the room stood an altar. Beyond it stood a wooden door, slick with a substance. The chamber felt newer than the rest of the corridors and hallways our heroes had trodden before. All assessed that walking carefully on the bars would not be much of a problem. Yet Sylvig knew a trap when she saw one. She emitted light, gazing between the iron bars to notice what looked like an army of copper tubes further below. Between the tubes, she noticed the burnt corpses of several goblins. Could they dispense gas, or worse, fire? Meanwhile, Alphonse raised his head to the ceiling and noticed spikes pointing downward in the doorframe. A portcullis. They deliberated. Was it worth following this path just because the dwarf sensed it was good? After discussing what to do next and blasting the altar to ensure it was sturdy enough, Alphonse and Sylvig opted to wait outside the door. While Rovak and Lazir would enter the room, the two adventurers stepped in warily, and as soon as they were fully inside the room, the portcullis dropped to the ground. The copper tubes flashed with fire that grew stronger by the minute. Lazir and Rovak dashed to the altar, where a riddle was engraved. Rovak yelled the riddle out loud.
"I feed the flame, yet I cannot be burned. Remove me, and I—"
Sylvig yelled back,
Air! The answer is simple as day. Just say it yourself.
Rovak uttered the word, and the flames below disappeared. The portcullis rose, and the door beyond the altar swung open. The party gathered up and entered a hallway that soon turned into a staircase, leading into the depths of the earth. The faint echo of rushing water pricked up their ears. They arrived in a domed circular room, similar to the riddle room several feet above. This chamber appeared to be of a more recent make than the rest of the maze. Dusty bunk beds lay in an alcove to the right, enough to host 8. After the beds were wardrobes filled with black clothing and climbing gear, ropes, grappling hooks, and spiky gloves made for climbing. In the center of the room stood a wide table with a large parchment and a letter resting on top of it. On the opposite side of the entrance, an arched way gave onto a precarious dock and a menacing stream of water. 2 boot soles came into view, resting oddly on the wooden planks of the wharf. To the left of the circular room, a workbench was covered in various tools, ranging from gunpowder to hammers and nails. Next to the workbench stood a chest. Above it hung a large painting depicting a crew of 8 people. A muscular orc stood there grinning, holding 2 of her mates by the neck with her elbows. The excitement and the pull that Rovak had felt until now dissipated, as if it had fulfilled its purpose. The dwarf recognized her instantly. Eglantine. It was the closest he had been to her in years. Rovak also recognized the smaller fellow the orc was holding, Broggin, a polder. The dwarf vaguely remembered Broggin. They had briefly sailed together on the Empress's Revenge before Eglantine joined the crew. The polder left without a word soon after she became boatswain. Alphonse put a hand on Rovak's shoulder.
Someone you knew?
You could say that.
Lazir and Sylvig sniffed around the room. The time raider caught Sylvig stealing a pair of climbing gloves.
And these are yours?
Clearly no one here has come in years, Lazir.
I know. Still, I find it rich coming from the lofty conduit who lectured me not a few hours past on what I shouldn't steal.
I think we should grab them. They will probably not have any use for them,
said the dwarf, his voice filled with a tinge of intrigue and puzzlement. Lazir and Sylvig took a look at the large parchment and the letter at the center of the room. It was a complex schematic of a troglodyte fortress with a myriad of spires that shot vertically from a mountainside. The part of the fortress that was nested in the mountain burrowed deeply into the earth. Hundreds of rooms, large and small. In the middle of it all, circled in red, was a room labeled Forbidden Library. In the corner of the parchment, Sylvig read, Inkwell Citadel. The 4 heroes all knew of Inkwell Citadel, naturally, an underground fortress carved by dwarves millennia ago. It had later been turned into a burgeoning school by some of the most scholarly among them when its resources were exhausted. It eventually became the Averant Empire's university. Academics from across Orden flocked to it to learn, teach, and share. They brought with them plethoras of books and arcane tomes, pious relics, and powerful trinkets. It was not long before thieves attempted to steal some of these coveted treasures. In response, Inkwell created an elite force of guardian dwarfs and dragon knights, and erected elaborate magical wards and traps to keep the greedy at bay. Sylvik grabbed the letter, reading it out loud.
Dear, I trust that the heist went well, but I haven't heard from you in quite a while. I hope that you have succeeded, and I await the delivery of the finger with much anticipation. Yours truly, Count Aristide.
Alphonse stepped away from Rovak and moved cautiously to the little dock. An underground river rushed from west to east, chipping away at the remains of a broken dinghy before disappearing into nothingness. The Fury took a look to his right, where the boots were, and discovered that they were donned by a cadaver of small stature, a polder. The man must have been there a while. His body was shriveling slowly. Alphonse noticed with horror that the polder's eyes and mouth had been sewn shut. The Fury beckoned to Rovak and Sylvik. He asked the dwarf if he was all right with assessing whether the person lying there was a friend of his. Rovak nodded and stepped through the archway. He knew in an instant Brogin. The conduit stepped next to the elementalist and produced a small, sharp tool, cutting through the strings that kept the polder's mouth shut. She dexterously inserted a finger and retrieved a worn and irregular gold coin. Very old. An odd skull was etched on one side. The other side bore a well-calligraphed word, traitor. The conduit examined the rest of the body. There were signs of strangulation, yet the polder seemed to have inflicted a wound upon himself with a knife, dipping his fingers into his blood to write erratically Inkwell on the wood. Sylvik realized with horror that poor Brogin must have been strangled to the point of losing consciousness, but not enough to be killed. His eyes and mouth were sewn shut while he was out. The self-inflicted wound had been his way out. Puzzled by the sight of such a gruesome scene, the three companions made their way back to the circular room. They found Lazier hunched over the chest, the Time Raider pulling with his many arms a pile of papers and parchments of all sorts. Intrigued, the four companions sifted through them. They found schematics of prisons and mansions, fortresses and castles, caves and cities. They spanned beyond the Averant Empire, touching every part of the continents of Vasloria. Lazier focused on finding any shred of evidence that could be linked to the letter or the Inkwell schematics. After searching a while, the tactician let out a victory cry. The schematics of a vast and sprawling mansion labeled Count Aristide Calderum, as well as a map of the world with the names of the crew and dates written on different locations as if keeping a tally. The names of the crew members read Eglantine, Zelvac, Brogin, Ulcinia, Justinian, Gertrude, Firenze, and Goldhammer. The latest date, labeled Inkwell, was dated a week ago. Looking over Lazier's shoulder, Rovak frantically searched the world map for the last mention of Eglantine. The last place the orc had been active was in Calderum with the rest of the crew. The four companions started pacing the room anxiously, reviewing the evidence they had found so far. The hunt for Antonine had taken an odd turn. The half-orc was not here. There were clues pointing to an infamous brothel, a maze below the town with no vampire in sight, and goblins searching for something to turn them human. Where in the blazes were the undead? All concurred that Antonine and the undead were the priority. Our heroes pocketed a few climbing gloves and grappling hooks, the letter and important schematics, as well as the world map before backtracking into the maze. Noting down the path they had followed, they decided to explore the western part of the maze. They reached a new junction, with the maze splitting northward and southward. The corridor to the north sported a door with an inscription our heroes had seen before: "Only the virtuous succeed." They gingerly opened the door and stepped in cautiously together, the door slamming shut behind them with a click. In front of them stood 5 statues of nobles depicting various scenes: a nobleman playing the violin, a second representing a noblewoman, arms extended in front of a fire, facing 5 urchins, a third showing a woman clasping hands with a fierce orc, a fourth portraying a nobleman mid-movement dancing, a fifth representing a man deep in thought with books, compasses, and arithmetic tools lying about him. Each statue had a small depression below it, enough to fit a small plaque. The ground was laden with exactly 5 of them. Beyond these statues, iron bars sheltered wide dart holes, as well as a mask inlaid with precious stones looking like 100 eyes. Above the iron bars, a carved stone read, "Only the hands of the true virtuous may unlock the path." To the right of the four companions lay a corpse, bloated and old, pierced by a thick dart closer in size to a lance. One hand held a sword, another clutched a damp journal. Sylvic gently pried the journal out of the stiffened fingers of the corpse, opening it carefully and reading out loud. The journal recounted the tribulations of one Hector of House Virtuous, how he lost the Burgmeister election to Colna, how he confessed to having an affair with Empress Alienor III, how she used him, and how sorry he was for what happened to his wife, Honorine. The journal ended with Hector renouncing all riches and living in the maze his forefathers built in search of the relic of his family.
Maybe we could learn more about this Honorine if we ask around town, but perhaps we should first solve the riddle in front of us,
said Sylvic, determined. Our four companions leaned over the plaques, each reading a statement. One paints without pigment, yet colors the mind. One fights without striking, yet defeats all foes. One moves without walking, yet reaches all lands. One builds without stone, yet their work stands for centuries. One teaches without speaking, yet all understand.
One fights without striking, yet defeats all foes,
said Sylvic out loud.
Surely this plaque must go below the statue shaking hands with an orc.
One paints without pigment, yet colors the mind. I reckon this could be narrating or storytelling. Perhaps this goes to the lass in front of a fire,
said Rovac.
Wait, Rovac. This could also go under the man playing the violin,
answered Sylvic.
One moves without walking, yet reaches all lands. This could be the music,
exclaimed Alphonse.
One teaches without speaking, yet all understand. This must be the dance,
added the Fury. Our heroes quickly slotted in the plaques they were quite sure of, leaving only the one paints without pigment plaque and the one moves without walking one. Making an educated guess, they agreed to put the former below the statue of the woman in front of a fire, and the latter below the violinist. All held their breath. Suddenly, the door behind the four companions swung open, and the iron bars rose in front of them, allowing Sylvic to pick up the mask. She studied it for a while, and understood that it was a relic of some fame called the Mask of the Many Faces, allowing one to don the appearance of someone they knew.
This must be what the goblins were after,
whispered the woad elf before pocketing the mask. Content with overcoming yet another challenge, the heroes made their way back into the dark corridors of the maze. Rovac asked for a moment, chiseling new runes into his stony arm, runes that spelled vampire. He felt a pulsing in his arm that clawed its way to his mind. The vampires were further south. They took the map Sylvic had drawn of the maze and followed a path that led them downward. They first had to go back east, where they saw several goblins eviscerated in front of a coiling staircase, but the pulsation was not leading them that way. They headed further to the south and happened upon a room with, yet again, the words, "Only the virtuous succeed." They opened the door onto a small room with a ruby on a little pedestal. Lazir grabbed his grappling hook and missed the ruby by a hair. As soon as the grappling hook fell to the ground, the ceiling, riddled with iron spikes, plummeted downward before rising slowly and revealing the impaled corpses of a dozen goblins. Rovac squinted from afar at the ruby and sighed.
This is a fake one, lads.
They left the room, the companions relying on Rovac's runes to pave the way. They walked for some time toward the south until they reached double-arched door made of smooth slabs of stone. Without hesitation, the elementalist tore a hole in the cold surface. Suddenly, a slew of skulls swarmed the heroes, and a horrendous shriek overwhelmed their senses. The two slabs burst wide open, and the four companions felt themselves pulled into the room by some unholy force. The light of several torches blinded them. When their sight came into focus, they discovered they were in a catacomb of sorts, with skulls and bones and wooden scaffolding adorning all the walls. In front of them, 4 sarcophagi rested in a puddle of shallow water, and a wraith clad in tatters, with a missing jaw and a forking tongue, held the body of a young half-orc, eyes rolled back and in a trance.
That's Antonin,
roared Alphonse. 36 severed hands came crawling from the skulls and bones in the walls. 8 decrepit skeletons armed with bows stepped onto the scaffolding across the room, craniums tumbling from the walls. Further down the room, where another 5 sarcophagi stood, 4 vampires discarded tonight's victims and turned toward the 4 companions, murder on their smiles. The wraith wailed once more, and 6 specters came rushing from the ground. The severed hands were the first to move, encircling them, clawing at them without mercy. Rovak pushed the crawlers away with vines sprouting from his back and arms.
This is what we planned for!
Screamed Lazir.
Everyone, get into position now. We can move before they do.
Alphonse slashed at the hands without mercy, while Rovak and Sylvic repelled the tiny horrors. Soon, the specters were upon them, the wraith wailing dark orders to them. She understood Lazir's keen sense of battle and sicked one of the specters onto him and Alphonse. In an instant, all became darkness, and the shallow water turned to ice. Another of the specters jumped on Rovak, but he deftly placed his hand on it. The strength of a meteorite sent the shadow against a sarcophagus and then a wall. The fury kept slashing at the severed hands, protecting Lazir. The elementalist sent ripples through the ground, like a wave pushing the undead upward and upending the advance of the specters. Sylvic raged with holy light and flooded the wraith with it. The creature wailed in anguish, a wave of hatred overcoming her as she clutched her son. The wraith roared, and all the heroes were sent flying through the air. Rovak was the first to wrest himself free from the wicked wraith's spell. He noticed the encroaching vampires. Touching the ground, he opened a hole in it. One of the vampires fell into the chasm. The fiend climbed out of the hole before being sent back into it, a decrepit skeleton falling in after it. Lazir could not see a thing when his feet touched the ground. He smacked a few of the hands around him and slid out of contact with the specters. The Time Raider could finally see again and barked orders at the group once more. Emboldened by the tactician's commands, Sylvic and Rovak overcame their enemies. The vampires were closing in on the group. Rovak opened a second hole, into which another vampire fell with a scream. The dwarf did not see the specter behind him that stole his life essence. In an instant he felt old and frail and tumbled to the ground. Alphonse rushed to the elementalist, cutting through the wraith and destroying one of her specters along the way. The fury helped the dwarf up when both noticed that Sylvic was still flying through the air. The wraith wailed again, and suddenly all enemies seemed to move quicker, in an eerie, automaton-like way. The ghost licked the face of her entranced son and screamed once more, piercing the ears of the 4 companions. Sylvic fell with a loud thud to the ground, almost out of life. The fury and the elementalist helped her up. The conduit was filled with righteous anger and placed a blessing upon the wraith.
You shall hurt us no more!
Sylvic yelled. Rovak used the forces of the elements to send one more vampire into another hole. The last standing vampire, dismayed by the disappearance of her companions, hissed, attempting to rush the fury, only to slide onto the frozen water. Lazir jumped and shoved her back into a spectre. Both the shade and the vampire turned to ash. The vampire Rovak had sent into a pit clawed his way up, racing toward him and standing close to the wraith. The wraith slashed at the conduit again, bringing poor Sylvic down once more. But the blessing placed upon the ghost took effect. The wraith's cry became weaker, and she dropped Antonin, all skeletons and specters trembling.
We need to bring her down now!
Seethed Sylvic. Rovak gritted his teeth, racing toward the wraith and placing his palm against her.
Let me introduce you to a meteorite's strength.
The wraith slammed into the vampire with a shriek. All the skeletons and specters turned to dust. The sheer force of the impact propelled the vampire into one of the sarcophagi, turning him to dust. Silence fell over the catacombs. Young Antonin came back to his senses, Alphonse rushing to his side. Haggard and tired, the boy explained to the fury that he had been having an awful nightmare in which his deceased mother was tormenting him. Antonin soon came to realize that they were in the catacombs of the Hospice of Law, the Burgmeister's cemetery. He pointed to the exit at the end of the room. The party moved across the room and pushed through the heavy wooden doors before heading up a coiling set of stairs. Soon enough, they were outside, breathing in the fresh air of the early morning. The sun was slowly rising on the slate and wooden roofs of Osmond. Our heroes briskly walked to the greasy Mug Inn. where a hungover and anxious Elliot awaited. The orc burst into tears at the sight of his child, embracing him with his ogre-like arms. He looked at the four companions and granted them access to the suite on the second floor, free of charge. Food and ale would forever be on the house for them. As they climbed upstairs, Sylvic asked Elliot if he could have trays of food brought regularly for them to recuperate. Each hero made their way to a separate room in the suite and fell onto their bed in an instant. All drifted into a deep, dreamless slumber, except one, Sylvic. She opened her eyes, walking among a thick crowd in a bustling town. Heavy bells chimed midnight. Her eyes twitched, feeling overcome by an urge to murder her way through everyone. Her mind focused away from this killing spree to hone in on her target, a red-haired young boy, shy of 16, covered in soot, walking a few paces in front of her. An odd anticipation filled her heart, half hatred and half glee. The young boy suddenly took a left and entered a small, dingy building made of chalk. She followed him, entering only a few seconds after. The conduit heard a door slamming shut above her and quickly climbed the stairs. On the other side, she heard movement, someone dropping their clothes, and the sound of water. Sylvic twisted the handle delicately and entered a small room with a bed and an all-purpose workbench. Opposite her stood a wooden screen, beyond which she could hear splashing. A mirror stood to her right. She stared into it, seeing only a twisted red smile evaporating amid a cloud of darkness. She pressed forward, drawing 2 daggers from her belt. She approached the young boy. He was shivering in a cold bath, unaware of his impending death. For a second, Sylvic looked outside. Hundreds of boats and vessels lined a wide port. A gargantuan lighthouse towering beyond the ships, bleeding purple light. This is not right, Sylvic thought. She caught herself in this nightmare. Why would she want to harm this young man? The woad elf felt the dagger trembling in her hand as she wrestled away her lust for murder. A voice that was not hers whispered through her teeth, "Get out of my head." She dropped the dagger, clattering to the ground. The young man lifted his head, screaming at the top of his lungs. A second later, neighbors were barging in. She jumped out of the window onto the nearby roof before the nightmare faded to nothingness. The four companions woke up rested from their harrowing night. Outside, they could hear the sound of boots and smell the scent of charred flesh. They peeked through the window. A cohort of the Order of Saint-Gerard patrolled the street in front of an awed crowd. It seemed the Inquisition had arrived in Osmond.